Jessica is the Louise Cowan Scholar in Residence in Humanities and Classical Education at the University of Dallas. By the way, University of Dallas, a fine Catholic institution, is specializing in classical and great books education in several different programs, and so I'm really grateful that there are schools still dealing in real solid education. She holds a BA in creative writing from Pepperdine University, the MA in English from the University of Dallas, and the PhD in religion and literature from Baylor. She's won several awards over the years, but two of them are pretty noteworthy. In 2018, she was awarded the Christianity Today Culture and the Arts Book of the Year Award for her book, Giving the Devil His Due, Flannery O'Connor and Fyodor Dostoevsky. Now, I'm waiting for the next book when she handles some serious people, you know. And then in 2019, not very long ago, she won the 2019 Hyatt Prize in Humanities, prestigious award from the University of Dallas for scholars who are ascending in a career devoted to the humanities and whose work shows extraordinary promise of a significant impact on contemporary culture. That's what we're about, but that's wonderful. She's published several other books. I'm going to name two of them because they're in our sort of direction very strongly. The Scandal of Holiness, Renewing Your Imagination in the Company of Literary Saints, and Learning the Good Life, From the Great Hearts and Minds That Came Before. So I think you could see we have a kindred spirit here, and I would like you to join me in welcoming Jessica Hooten Wilson. Welcome again.
Yes, thank you. Well, I did come several years ago, and I'm very grateful to the foundation for bringing me back, and this time as a speaker. It made a huge influence on my life at that time. I met Dana Gioia and David Lyle Jeffrey and people who have become mentors to me over the years. And now I got to bring my daughter back. So Hooten Wilson is on the front row. Joining me. So I'm getting to share all the things about England that I love with her, which is wonderful. I was actually, the last time I was here, I was pregnant with her. So hence the name Evelyn. I wanted to start, I know we've spent a lot of time in prayer, but this morning when Father Brad was mentioning George Herbert's poem, Love 3, it's one of my favorites. I was asked to read it in 2017 when one of my mentors passed away, Edward Erickson, and it was asked that I read it at his funeral, which I did. But it's also a beautiful way to start this morning. And so I'm going to rely on this poem as a prayer. Love bade me welcome, but my soul drew back, guilty of dust and sin. But quick-eyed love, observing me grow slack from my first entrance in, drew nearer to me, sweetly questioning if I lacked anything. A guest, I answered, worthy to be here. Love said, you shall be he. I, the unkind, the ungrateful, ah, my dear, I cannot look on thee. Love took my hand and smiling did reply, who made the eyes but I? Truth, Lord, but I have marred them. Let my shame go where it doth deserve. And know you not, says love, who bore the blame? My dear, then I will serve. You must sit down, says love, and taste my meat. So I did sit and eat. I have bad news for all of you bibliophiles out there. Reading books will not save your soul. It won't even make a bad person into a good person, though it might make a really uninteresting person more interesting. We do not read books because it's going to stave off the apocalypse. We do not read books so that we can hold our heads high above all the silly non-readers. We do not have selfish ambition when we read. We do not read for political agenda. We read because without books, our world shrinks. Our empathy thins. Our liberty wanes. We read books for the same reason people have been reading books for thousands of years. Because without them, our eyes are not enough by which to see. The time and place in which we live often blinds us to the perspectives and other ways of being that are not from our own experience. And we also read because we've been given this gift of imagination and a gift of intellect. And we express our gratitude to the giver of this gift by using these things. Often I'm asked, what should I read? And I have that moment where Alice is wandering through Wonderland, and I think, am I wandering right now in this question? I see the Cheshire Cat, and Alice asks him, where do I go? Right? There's many divergent paths. What book do I read? And the Cheshire Cat, do you remember he answers, where do you want to end up? And she says, I don't care. Well, then it doesn't matter which way you go. I have the same experience when I try to answer the question, what should I read? Well, what are you reading for? What's the purpose of your reading? Because that's gonna determine whether you're choosing a car manual or the Bible. You have to know what you're reading for in order to know what to read. Show of hands, how many of you read for fun? Right? Read for edification. Horace, 19 BC, said great literature is supposed to delight and instruct, right? Those are the two main purposes of literature, delight and instruct. And most of the ways that we consider reading is in that vein. The Christian context has baptized that somewhat and given us an even higher aim by which to read. I want to argue this morning that we can read for the love of God. And what I mean by that is not only certain means of reading and certain content of reading, but I mean the end of reading could be for the love of God. I'm mostly going to deal with great literature, but we had the earlier talk by Bruce Herman in which he set us up how to read art. And he drew on a lot of the same sources that have been very influential to me, C.S. Lewis, George Steiner, T.S. Eliot. In the Christian tradition, you had a way of reading the Bible that was completely different than what had come before. It drew somewhat from Jewish tradition, but it was also, we had a new sense with the incarnation. We had a new way of reading. When I was working on the book that's coming out next year, Reading for the Love of God, originally it was titled How to Read as a Christian. And so, of course, on Twitter, it was like, I would never buy a book by someone called How to Read as a Christian, right? What a horrible title. And yet, shouldn't we read differently as Christians? We see the full story, the creation, the fall, the redemption, the restoration. We see the incarnation. We know that things have meaning, that bodies are connected to souls, that words signify. There's drastically different ways of reading within the Christian tradition, and a lot of that we lost over the last several hundred years. And we don't even know that in some ways we are just products of this misacculturation about how to read. But if we return to this idea of reading as a spiritual practice, and I also want to say, I'm not saying anything heretical here. Do everything for the love of God in Colossians. Do everything. Reading is included in that. So what does that look like? What does it look like to read for the love of God? Someone earlier asked me, and I love questions, I'm excited about Q&A, but someone was asking me, does audiobooks count? I think it's such a great example of the ways that we have been misacculturated to assume that they do not. Until the 1100s, reading was an oral, communal experience. You did not read quietly and silently by yourself. And if you think about it in terms of the Christian church, that's why it doesn't even make sense that you pick for yourself a book by yourself that you read all alone according to your own way of reading it. That is a worldly perspective on reading. A Christian perspective on reading is to read the things that you've inherited from a tradition, the best that has been thought and said, that you're learning from those who are greater than you, that you have a humble place before a text, and I'm getting ahead of myself. But this is the way that C.S. Lewis read. This is the way that George Steiner read. C.S. Lewis said, the few receive art, most use art. There's been this self-glorification which we stand above our texts. And too often we see them as beneath us and we take what we want from them. We mine the source. And instead, all of the Christian tradition understood us as understanding, to stand under the text, to let it read us, to have that position of charity, to have that position of Eucharist before the text, to treat texts like they were neighbors, like they were friends. Someone, in Experiment in Criticism, someone asked Lewis, what's the good of reading a book? And he said, you might as well say, what's the good of listening to you talk? Isn't that exactly what reading is? You close your mouth for a few moments and you listen to what someone else has to say. You practice listening, which is practice towards obedience. You practice attention, which is practice towards prayer. And the work itself, you practice loving it, that might become a practice to love your neighbor better. Reading can actually be a spiritual discipline. Lewis said, look, listen, receive, get yourself out of the way. That's our first move when we start to read as a spiritual discipline. In the discarded image, Lewis also gives a helpful differentiation between two types of travelers, and I want to say that this applies to our two different ways of reading. So I'm going to quote Lewis. So he's going to be talking about an Englishman, but wherever you're coming from, imagine your own nationality in here. He says, one may carry his Englishry abroad with him and bring it home unchanged. Such a traveler goes abroad, Italy, for instance, right? And grumbles the food is not as tasty as the Olive Garden, right? Or he seeks out strangers who have a British accent because they feel like home to him. Or he complains about the albergo because it's not like the hotels that he's used to. Lewis says he complains of bad tea when he might have had good coffee. On the other hand, there's another kind of traveler who exemplifies this other sort of reading, the kind of reading I'm going to talk about today. Lewis writes, you can eat the local food and drink the local wines. You can share the foreign life. You can begin to see the foreign country as it looks, not to the tourist, but to the inhabitants. You can come home modified, thinking and feeling as you did not think and feel before. So with old literature, he writes, this second traveler is changed by what he reads. He's changed by the experience. He doesn't go to the text and try to make it what he wants it to be and stay within his blindness. He tries to see by its eyes and thus can see more. Everyone knows that famous line in Experiment in Criticism, right? When I read great literature, I become 1,000 men and yet remain myself. Like the night sky in the Greek poem, I see with myriad eyes, yet it is still I who sees. That's the beauty of Lewis, right? He gives us that beautiful picture to understand what reading looks like. This is what Steiner would call reading as a reader and not as a critic. When Bruce was talking earlier about the hermeneutics of suspicion, maybe most of us haven't studied, deconstructionism and literary theory, but we have received teaching that has simply made the assumptions that you should have a hermeneutics of suspicion towards the text. But I went to a university, Pepperdine, where in their motto was, the truth has nothing to fear from investigation. We do not approach text with fear that it will harm us. We know the truth, and therefore we bring those eyes to the text before us. We can learn and glean what is true and beautiful, and we do not have to be afraid of what is false because we see it and we know it. Let's look at one example today. And because it's C.S. Lewis, I'm going to give you Dorothy Sayers as my example. Dorothy L. Sayers. She's a good one. There's lots of different people I could have chosen for this, Lewis being one of them. But Sayers, I think, has a unique version of the story. If you are not familiar with her, Lewis said that she was the first famous person to ever write him. Which is so funny because now so many more people, not unfortunately, I love Lewis. I love Lewis. I'm here. Love Lewis. But at the same time, most people don't know Sayers, and yet she was more famous before him than he was. And she became famous as a mystery writer, and she seems to have several different lives. She was a mystery novelist, right? She was a translator of Dante, and she wrote these amazing plays in which she adapted the Gospels for a live radio audience for the BBC. So I'm going to kind of walk through how did she read to be able to make this art, right? The best reading, this again from Steiner, the best reading of an art is the art that comes from it. We've seen so much art here, right? Getting to see Hannah write art in response to the art that she's learned and known. That's how some of the best art is produced. So, looking at Dorothy Sayers, let's begin. She reads with hospitality and charity. What does that mean? She reads with love. She wrote mystery novels because she loved them. There was no elitism. There was no misunderstanding that certain books were necessarily better than others. And I want to qualify that, necessarily better than others. There are books that ask more of you. There are books that require more of you. But there's also a certain kind of reader that can read and glean God's truth from almost anything. The Tale of Despereaux, a children's book. I love it. Moral good and evil, visions of darkness and light. It's not necessarily worse because it's a children's book, right? There's some goodness there. So Dorothy L. Sayers had no worries about mystery novels being beneath her. She understood them as this path towards embodying theology. What does everyone want from a great mystery novel? They want the sin to be judged, the problem to be solved, the evil to be called out and known and no longer hidden. I think Christians have been suspicious, especially of fiction, for a very long time. It is not just lies, though, dressed up for our amusement, and they don't just tempt us away from the business of morals or doing good in the world. Sayers faced the same antagonism when she was writing mystery novels, but she did not consider this lovely pastime or a wayward hobby. Instead, for her, it could be the beginning of theological knowledge, though she really just started writing them to make money. So I'm adding a lot to her. And I'm purposefully doing so because I think a lot of times artists aren't even aware of what God's doing in their lives. Her motivation was, of course, to make money, and she loved these texts. She became the president of the Detective Club after G.K. Chesterton, right, which was a group of Agatha Christie and G.K. Chesterton. And she created Lord Peter Wimsey, who attended Balliol College, by the way. And she loved Peter Wimsey, and so many people kept writing her trying to make him a Christian. And she said, leave him alone. He does not have to answer to you. He does not have to answer to me. And I'm not going to change him to fit your desires for him any more than I would change him to fit mine. Now, what you see here is actually her imitating the Creator in the way that she creates her art. The freedom that the Creator gives us, she imitates as an artist, to not try to manipulate her characters to do the things she wants them to do. She writes this great poem that I think explains this well, and I love poetry. So I'm going to read this poem. So if you're starting to fade on me, wake up for poetry. And then I'll explain why I think this poem is so masterful for explaining how she was a novelist. She writes, "The work no master may subject, save he to whom the whole is known, being himself the architect, the craftsman, and the cornerstone. Then when the greatest and the least have finished all their laboring and sit together at the feast, you shall behold a wonderful thing. The maker of men that make will stoop beneath the cherubim, the towel and the basin take, and serve the servants who serve him. The architect and craftsman both agree the stone had spoken well, bound them to service by an oath, and each to his own labor fell. You see this Trinitarian idea that dominates her way of reading and writing. That's something that I think most of us are not familiar with. But when I talk about the reading experience, you must imagine that reading is not just you in a room by yourself. Every single reading experience is Trinitarian. Aristotle says this, and then it gets baptized by early Christians. So for Aristotle, there's the author, the reader, and the text. He's usually thinking of this in terms of theater, but we're going to talk about it in terms of books, because that's the genre. I mean, that's what we usually have, as most of us have books now in the 21st century. But you have the author, the reader, and the text. I'm making a triangle, so you can kind of visualize this. It's an easy mnemonic. The art of reading requires the author, reader, and text. A-R-T. Okay. So the experience of reading always requires these three pieces. Notice I didn't put them in a linear fashion. They're not in horizontal. They're in a triangle, because it's more like perichoresis. It's more like a dance or a play between those three different parts. The words of the text do not actually have any life in them until you, in imitation of the Holy Spirit, breathe life into them by reading them aloud. And suddenly the words have flesh and they take on meaning within you. And the words can go out and be embodied in the way that you read them. Your life becomes the greatest tropological reading of the text that can be, when you bring the parts of it to life in how you live and move and have your being. So it's a beautiful understanding. Now, Sayers wrote an entire book on this called The Mind of the Maker, in which she takes Aristotle's conception and she baptizes it into a Trinitarian form between the author and the reader and the text. But she does it as a writer, understanding this triad of making. In her play, The Zeal of Thy House, Sayers explains, and she uses St. Michael to give this speech, every work of creation is threefold, an earthly trinity to match the heavenly. The Father begets his image in the creative idea, the Son in the creative energy, and the Spirit in the creative power. In the first stage, the Creator beholds the whole work complete at once, God's entire idea. Then the incarnate one, through the effort, through the energy, moves the idea into matter. And finally, the Spirit brings the meaning to life in response in the lively soul, who listens, hears, and observes. This trinity of creation aligns not only with the creation of the work, but also with the reception of it. So they never lose one another. Sometimes in my Bible and literary theory class, I talk about our ways of reading Scripture and having that relationship between reader, text, and author. Also, then in turn, we get to have a new lens by which to relate to other texts and other authors, if you see how that works, right? So the Trinity actually affects how we read and changes the way we read other things by that experience. So you can see that there are actually Christian ways of reading, no matter how much people would push against that title. And I'm not going to be able to unpack everything, but if you look at Dorothy Sayers' approach to Dante, I think you get this glimpse into the Christian tradition. In the Christian tradition, you had a fourfold way of reading Scripture, and I'm not going to be able to dig into all of it. But the fourfold way of reading Scripture was how Dante wrote the Divine Comedy. He's imitating the Bible, and he's giving these four senses to us by which we can know the world. Sayers completely understood this, and if we want to dig in a little bit later in the Q&A into how she understood this, but she talks about Dante's four senses and says that at least two of them can regularly be applied to other literature. So the senses are literal meaning the words that are there, and for also historical is the way that they would have understood it, right? Literal meaning historical, what actually happened, what the words actually say. Earlier when Father Brad was talking about definitions, this is where you get into the literal reading. What do the words mean? And then figurative, or what is known as allegorical, would be the secondary sense, right? What do they signify? What do they symbolize? So when Bruce was talking about symbolon, what's that meaning behind what you see, behind the words that are there? Then the third is the tropological, which I hinted at a second ago. It's your response to the reading, right? How then do you live differently in the world if all of this is true that you just read? And then the fourth is eschatological, which is often reserved for scripture, but if you read Flannery O'Connor, that's all of her work is geared toward the eschatological, right? What does it look like at death, at the end? At the full end, but then each of us experience our own eschatology because each of us will die, right? So there's this invitation to view things with that end in mind. Sayers sees this in literature and is trying to hold on to it. She did say that she really didn't have a strong preference for allegory. Neither did Lewis and Tolkien, and that might be a really debated question in this particular group. But I think that all of them misunderstood allegory. So that's a huge claim to make. But I do believe that they misunderstood allegory because of the way that allegory was being considered in their time. It had lost the biblical resonance. So throughout Christian tradition, Augustine, Gregory of Nyssa, all of them read text allegorically, trying to understand the spirit within the meaning of the words. What was the Spirit doing? Another way of considering allegorically was, how does the Old Testament relate to the New Testament? Where's the fulfillment of things? But for them, allegory had been reduced to Bunyan. It was a one-to-one, right? It was a person named Christian who's only a person named Christian and doesn't have an identity apart from his allegorical significance. So you would see then why Lewis would say, Perelandra is not an allegory. Because the Green Lady is the Green Lady. But we can still read it allegorically. She's the Green Lady and she represents Eve. It doesn't harm her understanding as the Green Lady to also read her allegorically, any more than the suffering servant in Isaiah may be read according to its historical context and read according to the fulfillment in Jesus. The significance is still there, right? God is fully human and fully man in Jesus Christ. One doesn't take from the other. So I think that this literary misconception that was really prevalent during the time of Tolkien and Lewis, they were worried that it would take away the freedom of the reader that we've already spoken about. And so Tolkien, in his protest against allegory, he says, I prefer the label applicability. I mean, it simply is just a replacement in some sense for allegory, but it gave freedom to the reader, and that's what he was trying to do. Can you make it applicable, right? Can you apply other ways of seeing to it? I also love that when Sayers was going to translate the Divine Comedy, everyone was so angry with her because she was so well known as a British novelist, right? It'd be like John Grisham being like, I'm going to translate Beowulf. No one knew what to do with this. And yet because she loved books and she loved literature and she loved these stories, her idea of serving this work just meant I have to learn Italian more, right? I have to get better at my Italian. I haven't done this since my Oxford days. But she does. She serves the text. And when the BBC had asked her to write the life of Christ, she did not just come up with it on her own. Now, many of us, 21st century, we're thinking Chosen, The Passion. Replaying the life of Christ in art is not new to us. It was illegal when she does the BBC radio dramas. It was illegal. And she had spent the whole year in preparation studying the Gospels in Greek because she wanted to refamiliarize herself with the text, but also meaning defamiliarize herself with the misconceptions and the misinterpretations so that when she told the story, it wouldn't fall on deaf ears. It would be heard again for a new time and a new place, which of course is what all great art actually does. I'm going to give one quote about this because I can't resist. But I love that when these plays were aired on the radio, one of the, and I don't even think I can find the quote, so I'm just going to have to memorize it, but one of the guys said, we experienced two shocks this week, Pearl Harbor and Dorothy Sayers' play. Isn't that astounding? So it really was a shock to the system, the things that she had done. She was wildly subversive in that sense. In conclusion, this call to reading might sound silly. I know it does because I have taught for 17, 18 years now, and the number of students who have come into my classroom for a literature class and said, the problem in the world is that we are in here reading books. We should be out there doing things. I get that. There's beauty to be made. There's changes to be made. There's culture that needs to be lived into. At the same time, we don't stop being cultural creatures. And how are we going to make changes if we can't see what changes need to be made? If we don't have a prophetic vision beyond our own immediate response to things, if we don't have the humility that comes from practicing sitting under great literature and then responding. So there's so much work to also be done in each of our souls. And I believe reading is one of those resources that opens us up to that. I also think that in a world that tries to tell us we're computers or we're animals, the greatest protest we can make is to be those who love the good things and cherish them and uplift them. As I said in the beginning, reading is not a magical antidote to the unhealthy soul, but it can be a salve to the soul. It can be a buttress for the pious, maybe even freedom for the slave. Without reading as a regular spiritual practice, I think we are enslaved to our own cultural moments and to the lies of the world. And I think if Christians are going to be the church in the world, we have to imagine ways that reading might fulfill that calling. By reading in concert, by handing on cultural memory, we're drawing people into shared experience, unifying diverse voices in a beautiful harmony. I think the reading life is one that loves the word, refusing to be absorbed by the world and yet still in the world. Christians are then called to be the most human among us, to be readers, those who have not forgotten what it means to be people of the book. For in the beginning was the Word, and in the end is the book of life. Thank you.